I committed 100 hours to learning the MP5 Recoil. Here's how it went. Let's start out with my spray. This is how it looked with no hours spent practicing with the MP5. As you can probably tell, it was pretty bad. Throughout the video you'll see some details in the bottom left about what I'm working on, at what range, and also a rough outline of when I spent time practicing that. For example, I only really spent time learning the pattern itself between 0 and 5 hours, whereas I spent time between 70 and 100 hours working on my 100 meter moving shot. After I got the initial clips out of the way, my next step was to really understand the pattern itself, so I went to the wall. The pattern itself was a bit of a mess here, but here it is a bit clearer. It's still quite a lot to take in, so from here I wanted to break this down into 4 sections, and they break down roughly into part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4 to make the complete recoil pattern. I took some time to spray each section out of all so I could get a feel of timing and what it sounded like. I found it a lot easier to understand the recoil when I'd broken it down, but I also needed to have some way of remembering the parts. For me it was a down sweeping L with a sharp little left, then a sharp sweeping right, and then a flick left and up. This may sound like nonsense, but I'd say just try working on something that feels easy for you to remember and then go from there. Once I had a really rough idea of the recoil pattern, I was still going into this pretty blind, and I wanted to kind of break up the pattern at the very start and spend enough time, about an hour per section, learning each part of the recoil over various ranges. With how many hours I had ahead of me, spending my first 5 hours on just understanding this in detail felt really worth it to me. As you can see from the clips, I pretty much just sat in a fixed position, sprayed for about 10 to 15 minutes per part per range. I completed this in just under 4 hours, and kind of by the end of it I already felt like I had such a better understanding of the gun. This was like a big motivation for me to keep going at this point. Having spent time on the AK in the past, in a lot of ways I regret some of the inefficient ways I spent time learning it. My hope with the MP5 is I could really put everything I feel I've learned into practice and not only streamline the process of learning the MP5, but also maximise the end result and hopefully not be completely ashamed for spending 100 hours doing this. Now I felt like I had the pattern somewhat down, I wanted to try and get set up for the long sessions ahead of me by getting my head around the attachments. I won't spend a great deal of time on the attachments for this video. In the end it was a really flexible thing for me. As you can see from the first clip, the laser already has a big impact on the Aimcone itself, but when you start stacking those up it reduces it even more. You'll see that I pretty much use the laser on the tactical gloves throughout the video. They allow you to reduce the Aimcone without actually impacting how the gun feels. Changing the sights out always makes the gun feel different, but keeping those on allowed me to reduce the Aimcone without actually affecting the feel of the gun. With that said, throughout the video you'll see me go from no attachments to using the laser and the tactical gloves, handmade, and then some hollow at later stages. As you can see from this, attachments definitely do have a significant impact on the MP5's Aimcone. When I was learning the MP5 it felt good to understand some of the randomness that goes with it, but at a certain point you need to know whether you're missing shots because you're whiffing on a part of the recoil, or whether it's just RNG. So I would say take a flexible approach when it comes to attachments, or if you want to be safe, using hollow, laser and tactical gloves is a great way to train. Next came by far the most time consuming part, the stationary and strafing grind. Throughout this process I did a lot of shots, and I mean a lot of shots. I did the maths on it and it would roughly be over 2 million MP5 shots, give or take. I started this stage when I was about 5 hours in, and then spent the next 95 hours committing huge chunks of time to this. So I wanted to have a rough plan of breaking it up and making it more manageable. In the end I grouped together a stationary shooting range with a strafing range. I would then practice at this range without progressing for about 15 to 20 hours. These groupings were 25 metres stationary, then 50 metres with 25 metres strafing, then 75 and 50, then 175, finishing with practicing both at about 100 metres. The reason I wanted to do this is from my experience with the AK, I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself with either stationary or strafing. It's never fun to be beaming from one distance and then whiffing basic shots at a closer range just because you're moving. It's also not fun sitting at a comfortable range for too long and patting yourself on the back. I started out nice and easy, 25 metre stationary, One thing I will say is motivation was definitely a problem. Seeing friends come on to do wipes or play on the same Aimcone server as me was pretty rough. But fortunately during this process I did manage to do a whole bunch of MP5 PvP. Having pretty much mained an Aimtrain server for this goal, I was able to constantly practice in various arenas at different ranges, and it honestly helped me so much. However, when I set out this challenge, and for the purpose of this video, I wanted to focus on this being a real solo grind and to keep it simple. It's not always easy to find others that want to grind out a lot of MP5. And let's not forget, the main purpose of this video was to stop choosing Tommies over MP5 every wipe. 75 meters was a big jump for me. It immediately felt like I needed to be more accurate, and I even started to use attachments to reduce the frustration of RNG. At 50 meters I was definitely starting to feel more comfortable with my moving shots, and it was really rewarding to have that sign of improvement early on. Higher ranges have more need for tracking and predicting movements on shots, so the learning curve is steeper from here. When I got to around 75 hours, I actually started to enjoy the bullet drop and the tracking shots, although it's definitely not as satisfying as beaming targets at close range. Reaching 100 meter shots was interesting for me. I set out this challenge thinking most of the fights I'll have with the MP5 will always be less than 100 meters, and I still think that's probably true, but with the MP5 the bullet drop actually does make it quite fun at range. Mixed in with all that practice, I was also spending time on moving targets. A lot of practice servers have a simple moving targets, and it's a good way to practice more than just shooting a fixed target, which is really not how Rust PvP is. Before showing you some of the comparisons, I just want to cover Aimbots. Although I spent most of my time focusing on increasing my range shots, I also just needed to sink a bunch of hours into repetition. I honestly found Aimbots and moving targets to be a great way to sort of zone out and just autopilot. I kept finding myself watching YouTube videos whilst just grinding out hours of Aimbots. It also really mixes up the range and movement a whole bunch and helped me work on flicking onto targets or spraying between targets. One thing that you won't see much of in the video outside of Aimbots is using the silencer. I definitely recommend using it if you plan to learn the MP5. I use it on and off, but it's not great for recording as you can't actually see the bullet travel. If you're the type of person who watches videos or streamers in the background of playing, then I would definitely recommend jumping on Aimbots and just chilling on one particular gun. And here it is. These are all of the comparison shots put side by side. These are some of the first shots I took at the very beginning compared against some of the clips I recorded on the very same evening that I reached 100 hours. Altogether, even though it was pretty tough at times, I think it went somewhat well. I feel like I understand the recoil, not perfectly, but I definitely see big changes from my initial first clips. I also gained a bunch of confidence and actually got to start taking the MP5 out on white, so while I do know I've got a long way to go, I've actually started enjoying a gun that I honestly should have been taking out a lot sooner. But would I recommend it? Yeah, I would. It's lonely as hell, time consuming, and there's a bunch of telling yourself how trash you are. But if you know for a fact that you want to put some time and effort into improving one specific thing, and you think that the MP5 will fill that gap in your gameplay, then absolutely you should try something similar. Especially if you're already on Aimtrain servers learning the bow or the AK. Maybe you won't go as nutty as 100 hours, or maybe you'll go more, but definitely just set yourself some goals, a realistic time frame, and just crack on. Well, that's it from me, guys. I have a lot more to practice and I'll definitely continue to do so. I'll keep on increasing range and playing a lot more PvP. Thank you so much for watching. I had a great time making this video and I hope you found it useful.